take a second to service here. And so as always, it just takes a moment for Facebook, YouTube to service out to everybody and let everybody know, oh, hey, there's a stream going. But of course, this will be posted as well for people to watch later. All right, looks like it's going out there. So I am here joined with Kerry McDonald, and I'm really excited because she is a fantastic author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside of the Conventional Classroom. And I am a huge fan of her work in helping to promote unschooling. And for those of you who don't know, she is a senior education fellow at FEE. In addition to that, being an author and is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and regular Forbes contributor, so quite prolific there. And without further ado, I just would like to get the audience to know a little bit about your work and how you came to be involved with unschooling so that they get a little bit of a backdrop to what it is that drives your interest in it.
Right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm a big fan of yours on Facebook and love the content that you put out. So I'm thrilled to be talking with you today. Okay. So my real interest in education and alternatives to school began many years ago when I was in undergraduate and college, and I was an economics major, but took a lot of education classes and became increasingly interested in sort of the lack of choices that a lot of families had, being required, really compulsorily required to send their children to an assigned district school and sort of this monopoly system of mass schooling that as an economics undergrad, really struck me as problematic. So I began to take many more education classes, and during my senior year, this was in the late 90s, during my senior year, I had an opportunity to shadow a homeschooling family who lived nearby. And my world was shaken when I saw the possibility of learning outside of conventional schooling. This was at a time when homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all 50 US states just a few years prior, by the mid-90s. And so it really wasn't the mainstream option that we think of today, and certainly even more mainstream in light of the pandemic. At the time, it was really 1999 was the first year that the US Department of Education began tracking data on homeschoolers. And they counted about 850,000 homeschoolers at the time. Pre-pandemic, we were at almost 2 million. And now the estimates are, since the pandemic's begun, we have over 5 million independent homeschoolers. But yeah, it was at that time as an undergrad, seeing this family, seeing the way that this particular child learned outside of school and how curious and creative she was, and her, full immersion in her community, kind of authentic socialization by being around the people, places, and things of her community. That really struck me, and it was in stark contrast to that same semester when I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school with the same age group of the homeschool child I was following, and just seeing this tremendous difference, of course, in the ways that these children were learning. And I had gone through K-12 public school, and that was all I knew. So it wasn't until I saw this other way of learning and of growing that I realized, wow, there's so many possibilities, so many alternatives that we could be pursuing and be inspired by. And that was really the beginning.
Oh, wow. What drove you to that interest in terms of your personal desire? Did you see it more as an ethical thing at the beginning, or was it more just a practical thing in terms of, oh, I see they're more interested?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think at the time, and even in some of these education classes that I started to take as an undergrad, I was believing the myth that we had been told about the origin story of the common school movement and public schooling beginning in the mid-19th century. And I believed that it was, designed to, create this equal opportunity for all of these young people. And once I sort of dug in a little more to seeing homeschooling and these other kinds of alternatives to school, I realized that it was truly a myth. I mean, if we look at the history of compulsory mass schooling in the US and around the world, it's not this sort of magnanimous fable that we've been taught. I mean, for example, here in the US, Massachusetts, where I am located, I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. Massachusetts passed the first compulsory schooling law in 1852. And, for the first time, parents were required under a legal threat of force to send their children to school. And at the time, it was very much focused on an anti-immigrant sentiment. There was a massive influx of predominantly Irish Catholic immigrants into Boston. The population of Boston doubled between 1820 and 1840. A lot of particularly Irish Catholic families fleeing the Irish potato famine and other immigrant groups pouring into cities. And this really challenged the dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture at the time. And so there really was this push toward creating these compulsory common schools that would be taxpayer funded, that would essentially assimilate these immigrants into this dominant culture. And so they were purportedly secular. Of course, this is, again, the myth that we're taught, oh, these were secular public schools and everybody could come and it was wonderful. And yet they were, anything but. There was the King James Version of the Bible, Protestant teachers and texts, definitely the kind of dominant Protestant ethos at the time. And many Catholic families rebelled. They said, we're not sending our children to these schools. And they created their own parallel system of parochial schools that over time, over the ensuing decades of the 19th century, different states passed what are known as Blaine amendments that continue to kind of stymie education choice and school choice policies in a lot of states that were blatantly anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. And then in the early 1920s, the state of Oregon banned private schooling entirely, said young people must learn in government schools only. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that case in 1925, called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, saying that children are not the mere creature of the state, that they were not required to just learn from public school teachers and public school institutions alone. So, there's sort of this long history, and I think that was what really compelled me to learn more about this. And then I ended up going to graduate school and education policy at Harvard and becoming more and more interested in education choice and education options.
Wow, that is incredible how that spark of history led you down your path of investigating what, really happened. Just finding one piece of information that, contradicted the reality you're used to, kind of sprung forward and led you on a whole journey of realizing how much more was actually just a lie or a myth or crony or corrupt. And then it was about control over children. So on that
families,
note, yeah, exactly,
right.
Exactly. On that note of control over families and children, with everything that's happened, as you noted, with the lockdowns and shutdowns due to the government's fear-mongering over the pandemic, would you say that you've seen some changes in attitudes towards unschooling and homeschooling because of parents suddenly having kids at home and them being able to see what's actually going on?
I think that's absolutely true. So, for example, my book, Unschooled, came out in May of 2019, so a year before the pandemic hit, but it had a huge uptick in sales last spring as, of course, over 50 million US school children were suddenly learning from home with varying degrees of connection to their local school and kind of remote schooling and hybrid schooling and so on. So I think there was a lot of interest. And of course, as I've said from the very beginning, pandemic homeschooling is nothing like the real thing. All of us certainly last spring were disconnected from our communities and from, again, those people, places, and things around us that make homeschooling, such a wonderful way to learn. So it was a challenge for everybody, homeschoolers and, of course, school children as well. But I think it did provide a catalyst for a lot of families who, I spoke even anecdotally to families who said, I've always been intrigued by homeschooling. I've thought about pulling my kids from school, but I lacked that inertia to make it happen. And then with the pandemic and the school shutdowns in the spring, suddenly they had that opportunity. And so many of them withdrew their kids last spring from the district school for independent homeschooling. And we saw that trend continue. It was actually surprising to me because, of course, it was such a tumultuous spring for everybody. Our whole lives The way we worked, the way we lived, the way we interacted, was completely upended. But I was pleasantly surprised that really just a month into the school shutdowns in April, EdChoice came out with one of the first surveys of parents of how things were going. And they found that more than half of the parents in that survey had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did prior to the pandemic. So again, I thought, gee, if you think this is good when we're stuck at home and we can't go to the museum or the library or see friends, just imagine the real thing. And sure enough, subsequent surveys, Real Clear Politics, a USA Today poll, and so on, began to show similar trends over the coming months of parents being more amenable to homeschooling and finding it more fulfilling than they had expected. And so then what we started to see were parent behaviors come summertime begin to reflect a lot of these polling data. So one of the first bits of information was the first week of July in North Carolina. So many families went online to register their intent to homeschool in that state that it crashed the system's non-public education website. And sure enough, North Carolina is seeing skyrocketing rates of homeschooling. Similarly, we had NPR reporting in July a 21% increase in registrations for homeschooling. We saw a 75% increase in Vermont. And then in August, Gallup came out with a comprehensive poll finding that 10% of families were planning to homeschool this year, which was double rates of previous years. And public school enrollment going down to 76%, which was a 7% drop over last year. So just a huge exodus from public schools. I just wrote an article at fee.org last week about the decline in enrollment, plummeting enrollment in public schools across the US this fall, and the correlated increase in independent homeschooling. NPR reporting, some just astonishing data of record levels of public school enrollment drops as families turn to homeschooling. And then one final statistic, just to show kind of where we're at. Education Week just last week reporting 9% of families choosing independent homeschooling, not tied to a district, not remote schooling or school at home tied to that school district, but actual independent homeschooling, pulling a child from a school to have that freedom and flexibility of homeschooling. So we're talking, at least 5 million children now being homeschooled during this pandemic. And I think that that's likely to continue even after the virus ends, at least in some increase in numbers going forward.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it is incredible just how many people I've seen myself reaching out and asking about resources, among which I recommend your book, for unschooling because of all these shutdowns and all the craziness in the schools. And they don't want to deal with it. And it really is, I would say, trying for kids to be in environments that are so overly restrictive more than ever. Where they're constantly being monitored for every little social behavior and every little thing they're doing with their face and their distance. And it's just really not healthy for kids. Have you seen yourself a lot of families express a desire for homeschooling or unschooling because of how their children were feeling in school?
Yes, I mean, certainly that was the case pre-pandemic, that, a lot of the families who were choosing to opt out of conventional schooling for homeschooling or self-directed education were doing it because they felt that schooling wasn't a good environment for them. In some cases, it was abusive. They were being abused by peers, bullied was rampant, or even educators not feeling like they were in a nurturing kind of environment. So certainly that was the case before the pandemic. And then I think what, some parents started to see when schools shut down last spring was maybe their kids were less stressed. Maybe they had some more time to sleep and to engage in interests that were meaningful to them. And of course, there were so many online resources that were sprouting in the spring, all kinds of businesses and organizations, museums, libraries, everybody putting information online, resources online, companies making a lot of their products available for free in those early days of the pandemic. So I think a lot of parents saw that there were these tools and resources available to them and to their children that would enable the kids to continue to learn and perhaps learn even more and better than they were learning in school. Because I think that's part of the maybe the misconception about homeschooling is we feel like, and we've been conditioned to believe, that you can only learn if you go to school. And often it's not until adulthood that we realize, well, gee, we can continue to learn. Maybe we can even learn better. Maybe we can really become engaged in some of our interests and passions in much more meaningful ways that lead to much more robust learning and discovery that we retain, and that helps us in whatever path we choose in adulthood. But I think many of us still have that mindset around schooling, that's how children learn. And again, with the pandemic and everyone being at home and realizing this abundance of resources at our fingertips, literally, I think parents were able to say, gee, I can do this. I can be here for my children. I can facilitate where I need to facilitate, but there's so many resources that my kids can take advantage of that I don't have to be kind of sitting at the kitchen table, going through a curriculum, being the teacher at home. There's lots of other ways to approach this.
Absolutely. And in your own life and experience, how would you say, working with your own children has influenced or helped your ability to communicate to others how they can effectively homeschool/unschool their children?
Yeah, so in the book, I give examples. I sort of weave in my personal story of my 4 children who have never been schooled. And one of, I think, the stories that highlights this the most is the story of my older daughter, who's 13 now, almost 14, almost. And she started taking martial arts classes several years ago. There was a new martial arts studio that opened in our neighborhood, and she was really intrigued by what she saw happening through the window. And so she sort of took the initiative to say she wanted to try a class there, and met with the instructors and just fell in love with martial arts, and is on her way now to black belt in martial arts. Very rigorous, very focused on a lot of perseverance, a lot of determination, rigor in terms of what that involves. But it's her choosing to do that. And then what came from that interest in martial arts was an interest in Korean language and culture, because a lot of the forms that she was doing and the weapons that she was using in her martial arts demonstrations had Korean names. So she became interested in Korean language and culture and history. And so I was able to suggest Duolingo, which is a free online language learning software. So initially she started off taking some Korean language classes there and taking some Korean history classes through Unschooled.com, which is another kind of low-cost online resource for both homeschoolers and children who are in school. And her interest continued to evolve to the point that Duolingo wasn't really enough for her. She wanted something a little bit more intense. And so I was able to find a native Korean language speaker in my city through putting out a message through various local listservs. And now she meets with this tutor 3 times a week, and has been doing that for a couple of years now. And it's really well on her way to being quite fluent in Korean, and hopes to visit South Korea someday, maybe do a study abroad program. So that's just an example about how allowing children's passions and interests that are unique to them drive learning and discovery. And even, I think this is another misconception, certainly with unschooling specifically, is there's this idea that, well, kids aren't really learning anything, right? It's just sort of this free-for-all. And I don't think that's true at all. I think in this case, again, with this Korean language example, she uses a very kind of traditional textbook, and some, she takes tests and quizzes and, does a lot of the things we would think about in terms of conventional schooling, but it's her driving that process. It's tied to her interests. And crucially, she knows she can quit at any time, that this is not something that is imposed on her from above, but something that's really driven by her.
Right. I think that's a great example, because it does highlight a misconception that people come to the table with when thinking about unschooling and homeschooling. They think, oh, well, does that mean they just never can have any classes or any types of tests or like studying anything? It's like, no, it's not about whether or not you may take a class or have a grade or this or that. It's whether there's choice in it. And if someone wants to take a traditional class, maybe they take, whatever, a local community college class, or they, as you said, take a private instruction with a tutor, and they might have some, formal assessments. As long as it's being self-chosen and that's desired by the learner, that's what matters. And I think communicating that, I think, is so crucial, that people don't miss that you can still be applying for various types of either academic outcomes or formalized outcomes in learning, as long as you're just choosing it because you actually wish to do it. So
Right.
I really appreciate your bringing that up.
And maybe I can just jump in too and add a little bit to that as well. I know you're familiar with the work of Peter Gray, who's a Boston College psychology professor and the author of Free to Learn, and he wrote the foreword to my Unschooled book. And he and his colleague Gina Riley have done some excellent research on unschoolers, young people who grow up unschooled, and what some of their outcomes are in adulthood. And one of the surveys that they did on grown unschoolers found that quite a large percentage of them went on to college, did just fine in college, and a lot of them took community college classes during their teen years. And this is something we find true of homeschoolers more broadly than just unschoolers. But homeschoolers oftentimes will get an associate's degree at age 18 when their same age peers are just getting a high school diploma, and then they're enrolling in college as a sophomore, saving a lot of money, having all of that experience and those credits, and really kind of taking charge of their own education. So that's another example of where you could have some formal instruction, some formal learning in those teen years in particular, that kind of set you up if college is where young people want to go. And of course, there are all kinds of alternative pathways as well to adulthood.
Absolutely. And when it comes to signaling and, the ways that people think about how someone is marked for success, or whether they're worthy of a job or college, in your experience, have you seen alternative paths to these things in terms of whether it's a college application or job application, ways that young people can signal their accomplishment, but without necessarily having to rely on, I have a high school diploma?
Yeah, so in the chapter I have on unschooled teens in the Unschooled book, I talk about Isaac Morehouse and his work in founding Praxis, which is an apprenticeship program for young people, as in many cases an alternative to college, or in some cases young people may have enrolled in college and realized that this wasn't really helpful for them, racking up all of these student loans and wasting a lot of their time not developing real skills, and so then choosing this apprenticeship path. And so they do an excellent job at Praxis of preparing young people for the workforce, for things that matter to them, for careers that are meaningful to them, by providing them with these sort of alternative signal options, right? So learning computer skills like Excel, and being able to be valuable to employers so that you're able to enter into a job already well ahead of potentially your college graduate peers, because you have some real skills and knowledge and a proven track record of ability through this apprenticeship model that sets you up well for success.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know a Praxis, and their good work with, getting young people to be able to, get that internship and have an active support, because it's not that they just throw someone into internship. They actually provide a support to them in their writing and help them develop their speaking skills and things like that. So it's really great to see it. There's so many different opportunities for young people to try out their skills and actually provide value to someone, in the real world of actual business, than just, writing a paper and, it just goes in the trash bin afterwards. So that's really great to see. When it comes to I would say, unschooling process and getting someone to be open to that, to opening their mind to thinking about, what that could be like. How do you recommend someone start to challenge their misconceptions or mislabels of what that entails? How do you suggest someone starts to change their mind and think about what that could look like for them and their family?
Is this about alternatives to college? Is that what you're suggesting?
It could involve that as well. Just the idea of how does someone start to challenge their thinking in this arena? What would you recommend someone, ask themselves, compare to things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have two responses to that. One is more, reflect on our own experience in school. Most of us went to school, right? And realize, how much do we remember? How valuable was what we learned to what we're currently doing now? And, was it really worth those thousands of hours of our childhood and adolescence to be in that kind of coercive learning environment where our individual interests and talents are often not nurtured and sometimes sort of actively discouraged? So I think part of it's that. I think also in adulthood, particularly with the rise of the internet and so many online resources, we're able to see in adulthood the ways that we learn now, particularly, with YouTube and some of these other, instructive videos, things that we may not know how to do. What is the first thing that we do is go to YouTube to figure something out. And I think it gives us this sense in adulthood, certainly, of personal agency. You don't always have to, for example, call the plumber, because now you might be able to go on YouTube and figure out how to fix that leaky toilet. And then if it doesn't work, then you call in the experts. But often it's our sort of our first response is to see if we can learn something ourselves. And I think that carries over to a lot of today's parents realizing that there are so many other ways for children to learn. I mean, historically, again, if we go back to kind of the origin story of compulsory mass schooling, you went to school because that was where the books were, that was where the knowledge was and the teachers were. And now, of course, that's all around us, often for free, that we have this abundance of learning materials and tools available to us, both as adults and as younger learners. And so I think that that's something that, adults really realize, and maybe we can pass that along and want to give that same agency to our children. So that would be, sort of the first part of the response. The second part of the response, I'd go back to, again, some of the data, some of the research that Peter Gray has done and others. And one of the most interesting findings in the research that Peter Gray did on grown unschoolers was finding that more than half of the people surveyed in his report were entrepreneurs working in jobs or careers that were tied to interests that they developed in childhood or adolescence, because they had that freedom to explore and to discover and to nurture some of these early interests that then led into these entrepreneurial careers. And so I think that's another testament to, when we allow personal agency and freedom, we're able to encourage creativity and ingenuity and that entrepreneurial spirit that, of course, serves us all so well.
Absolutely. And in that vein, with parents who may be scared of, what may happen, and if they feel inadequate in terms of being able to support their child, what would you say to those parents who might be, nervous about their capacity to help their child, as a facilitator, help them learn? What encouragement would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to do is to connect with local homeschoolers in your community. I know certainly since the pandemic and the school shutdowns, grassroots Facebook groups and homeschooling networks have been inundated with families interested in homeschooling. And many, I would say most, have been incredibly welcoming to these parents who are looking for connection, looking for resources and guidance on where to begin. So that would be the first step, is to, connect with those in your local areas. And then in terms of, unschooling and self-directed education more broadly, I mean, there's a lot of more of sort of national networks that you could tap into. Sometimes it's harder to find local groups of unschoolers depending on where you live, but you could be able to find broader Facebook groups, for example, that would focus on unschooling, and then find your own way of interpreting all of that. What's your own approach to homeschooling or unschooling? what works for you, your child, your family, your lifestyle. And of course, then we have the pandemic and the lockdowns going on as well. That makes a lot of this difficult, more difficult to connect with people in person, for example, than would be typical. So I guess that's another piece of my advice is don't get discouraged thinking this is all that there is, when it's just not that way at all under typical circumstances.
And with those who might conflate unparenting with unschooling, how would you address that? This idea that, unschooling just means, just let them do whatever. You don't care. You're not there for them. How would you respond to those who might try to say that that's what unschooling is?
Well, I think most unschoolers would say the same thing, is that unschooling is not unparenting at all. I do talk in the Unschooled book about sort of a range of approaches that would fall under the unschooling umbrella, from families who really embrace kind of full freedom in all aspects of life, to maybe some more eclectic models, or more parent-led models. So it's kind of a big umbrella under the term unschooling, and you have to find what works for you. Another important point that I make in the Unschooled book is that it's up to parents to make sure that your children are highly educated, that they are highly literate and highly numerate. And I would say this is true whether your children are homeschooled, unschooled, or in a conventional school, that at the end of the day, it's up to parents to make sure their children are learning and growing and developing into full, thriving adults.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is important that people understand that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the environment is. A child could go to your traditional compulsory public school and come out very uneducated, especially because much of what they're doing is not really meaningful critical thinking and long-term learning. It's more just, memorize enough to pass the test and then get to the next class and then forget that and then keep going until you hopefully get, your high school diploma. The standards are definitely a bit different that the public school advocates hold for when it comes to unschoolers, because they say, oh, okay, well, if you just are barely literate and you pass public school, whatever, it's all good. But if it's like you're an unschooler, oh, you better be going to, Harvard or something. Otherwise you're not successful. It's kind of a double standard there that a lot of people who have criticisms of unschooling have. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. And of course, a lot of homeschoolers do go to Harvard. They're frequently profiled in various Harvard periodicals. But I think your point is right, that there tends to be sort of this higher scrutiny for homeschool children, maybe than conventionally schooled children. Although the data on academic achievement of homeschoolers tends to show that homeschoolers outperform their schooled peers. One survey I really like that was done recently by Daniel Hamlin at the University of Oklahoma finds that homeschooled children are 2 to 3 times more likely than their schooled peers to go to a library, museum, or historic site in the course of a month. And this was pre-pandemic again, when he was doing this research. And they're 1.5 times more likely to go to a zoo, an aquarium, or a bookstore than their school peers. So again, this authentic socialization, immersion in our communities, those are the things that really lead to, I think, a highly educated individual.
Absolutely. And one of the criticisms following on that I often hear a lot or get a lot is, what about those kids who are from poor families, or their families don't care? What about them? How does that, affect them if, you're saying unschooling for everybody? How would you respond to that kind of criticism there?
Yeah, I have 2 responses to that, or maybe 3. I think if you look at the current data or the pre-pandemic data on homeschooling, homeschooling was really becoming much more reflective of the overall U.S. population, and actually more heavily skewed towards kind of the lower income brackets than typical public school enrollment. So that doesn't seem to be as much of a barrier. The second point to that is that if we look at data currently, just coming out over the last month about these new families, this influx of families who have chosen independent homeschooling, there's a significant number of them that are low income. And so I think that again speaks to this idea that families gravitate toward homeschooling of all types, that this isn't just something, for the privileged or the affluent, that in fact, if anything, it might be families who do not have financial means who are choosing this for their children because they're so dissatisfied with public school options and maybe can't afford private school options, because we have seen an influx in many private school enrollment because private schools in many states have opened as public schools have remained shuttered or have remote learning during the pandemic. And I think a lot of parents are saying, well, homeschooling is what I can do. And then kind of a corollary to that is some of the work that certainly Cato's Center for Educational Freedom focuses on, and some of my work at FEE is on expanding education choice and thinking about ways of enabling families to have some of those tax dollars back that are currently funding public schools. U.S. taxpayers spend over $700 billion every year on K-12 public schooling. And I think a lot of parents, particularly in light of the pandemic, have realized, gee, why don't I get some of that money back, particularly if my school isn't opening? And I know you had Corey DeAngelis on your show recently, and he talks about this all the time. Why aren't we funding students instead of systems? So I think that speaks to much of this as well, is how do we expand education choice and options to more families? It's to provide these education choice mechanisms like education savings accounts or tax credit scholarship programs that make education choice a reality for more families. But that's where I found it really fascinating that even without those resources, even without those school choice mechanisms, we're still finding more lower income families currently, in light of the pandemic, choosing homeschooling. And this just gets to the point that every family wants what's best for their children in terms of their education, and will do whatever it takes to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, of course, parents care about their kids by and large. And so just thinking about why unschooling is the most ethical and healthy way for kids to learn is really important for them to understand, because it'll just be attractive to them at that point, understanding that it is the best way and the most ethical way for young people to learn. What would you say would be some important stepping stones to helping to move away from the compulsory schooling paradigm and helping get more people open to and on the unschooling path? I know you mentioned savings accounts and things like that, but what else do you foresee being as necessary stepping stones?
Yeah, I think certainly expanding education choice mechanisms. I think, and Corey has some good data on this as well, just the openness to school choice among families has increased since the pandemic, as I think they realize that so much of this money is caught up in these bureaucratic systems, and why isn't it available to the families? Why isn't this funding following students again instead of systems? So I think there's a much more openness to school choice policies, and certainly those would be continuing to be policy areas to focus on and legislative efforts to endorse. But I think too, just the pandemic itself has shown, almost every American family, right from the beginning, you can live and learn with your children at home. It's not always easy and not practical. Certainly difficult in a pandemic when we're disconnected from our larger support networks. But I think everybody at least got a taste of it. And that's, I think, led to a greater appreciation of homeschooling. Certainly has led to this massive increase in at least temporary homeschooling during the pandemic. And I think we'll continue to see these numbers stay higher than they were pre-pandemic as parents do realize all of these options. And then, of course, entrepreneurs are really stepping in to create resources for homeschooling families or for remote schooling families during the pandemic to try to provide some of that content that maybe kids are missing when they are severed from their classrooms during the pandemic. So I think we'll see more of that entrepreneurship that will expand options for families. And then I would say too, one of the examples I like to give is the book, The Politics of Institutional Reform by Terry Moe at Stanford, who researched Hurricane Katrina and its devastating impact on the families and the communities of New Orleans back in 2005. Despite that devastation, though, it was this opportunity to really sever much of that institutional control, much of those bureaucracies, and sort of mandates from above, those went away as a result of this natural disaster. So that New Orleans became an almost all charter school system as a result when they rebuilt the New Orleans education system. So really transformative change. And I think we're in that same moment now with education amidst the pandemic. I think that it won't go back to normal because so many parents now feel more empowered to be in charge of their children's education. They want more choice. They want more freedom. They want more autonomy. And in some cases, parents themselves have been given more flexibility and autonomy during the pandemic. You know, many parents are able to work from home who may not have been able to prior. The Brookings Institution putting out a report a couple of months ago saying that they expect working from home to continue long after the pandemic at much higher rates than pre-pandemic, as workspaces realize that they can actually do this, and in some cases have higher productivity with workers working from home. So it could open up many more opportunities for families to think about how they can live and work and learn at home even after the pandemic.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it really sometimes takes that level of transformation and disruption to get to the point where you can get people to actually think about these amazing new opportunities. And with everything going on in terms of new developments and new ideas, what do you foresee yourself doing and contributing toward this end in the coming years? Do you have any new projects, books, or any, things that you're really setting your vision on and trying to help people understand the benefits of unschooling and self-directed education?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to continue my work pushing and advocating for school choice and education choice mechanisms like ESAs and like tax credit scholarship programs, and really allow parents to realize that now they have this newfound empowerment. They have been put back in charge of their children's education in ways that would have been unfathomable pre-pandemic. They're seeing what their kids are learning in schools through these remote learning hubs, or maybe their kids are not learning in schools, and they are demanding choice and options. So I think it's a great opportunity to expand that. So that's definitely going to be a lot of my work. And then, yeah, I mean, I'm still focused, certainly at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, really focused on free market solutions to education, to expanding options for more families through entrepreneurship, and encouraging innovation in education. If we think about all of the choice that we have in every other area of our lives, it's really remarkable. And yet with education, particularly K-12 education, it's so narrow for most families. And there's a huge choice gap, I think, there. I mean, if you look at some research that EdChoice came out with about a year ago now, they found that while nearly 80% of young people attend an assigned district school, fewer than a third or fewer than 30% of their parents would prefer them there. So there's just this tremendous choice gap about what parents want for their children's education, certainly what students themselves want from their education, and what we're currently mandating by force for education. And so I think to the extent that the free market and entrepreneurs can close that choice gap, can create these new models that are accessible to more families, I think we'll all be better off.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what it boils down to, is freedom to choose in the first place. And that, starts with young people being able to choose the learning and goes all the way up to adults too, being unschoolers for life. Would you agree with that? The idea that unschooling is not just limited for children?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we're all in adulthood, we're all unschoolers. This is where I think we realize the ability for us to take charge of our own learning and rediscover some of our interests and passions, maybe reconnect with a love of reading that might have been smothered when we were in school and told what books to read and how long to read every night and not read ahead. And then in adulthood, we might actually, reconnect with that love of reading and realize when we're reading things that are meaningful to us, all of a sudden it's enjoyable again and opens up so many avenues just of discovery for us. So yeah, I think again, unschooling is something adults do every day, and it's just about extending those possibilities to our kids.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kerry. I appreciate your coming on. And for people who want to follow up with your work, read your book, what are the ways that they can connect with you and keep up to date with the things that you're writing about and talking about?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is to visit my website at the Foundation for Economic Education. If you go to fee.org/Kerry, Kerry, you'll see all my recent articles, a link to my book, and also links to my social media accounts, and can go ahead and send me an email.
Okay, fantastic. I just submit that to everybody so they can see it there in the comments, fee.org/Kerry. Perfect. That's great. And your book, Unschooled, if someone wants to pick that up, where is that available?
Yeah, so again, you can go to fee.org/Kerry, and the link is right there, or you can get it at any bookstore if the bookstores are open in your area, or on Amazon or your favorite online retailer.
Oh, great. So it's in a lot of different places.
That's right.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to whatever else you're going to be writing about. Hopefully, maybe there's some more books in the pipeline in the future. I'm really excited to see them. And I really appreciate everything you're doing to promote unschooling for everybody. So thank you.
Oh, thanks again for having me.
My pleasure. All right. Take care, everybody. And we will see you next time.